Welcome back to Cheddar's Opening Bell. Well, as Congress and the White House remain in a stalemate over stimulus negotiations, skills in communication and persuasion seem to be lacking. Well, perhaps some in Washington might want to pick up the book from our next guest. We are joined by former South Carolina Congressman Trey Gowdy. He's out with a new book called Doesn't Hurt to Ask, using the power of questions to communicate, connect, and persuade. Congressman, great to have you on today.
Yes,
Certainly
ma'am.
now would be a very good time for better communication. What do you make of Washington's inability to cut a deal while millions of Americans are unemployed through no fault of their own?
Yeah, I think the challenge in Washington is when there is no consequence for inaction, what you're going to get is inaction. Both parties perceive it to be in their political best interest to insist upon what they want. So, I mean, I used to hear a lot at the grocery store, why can't you reach across the aisle? Why can't you compromise? Geopolitics is reactive. It reflects the people. And there is a perception, be it correct or incorrect, that that is what the people want. So you got redistricting, which is incredibly polarizing, and then you have the media influence, particularly on the Republican Party. You're going to have inaction unless you make it painful for them to not act. And right now, they don't feel the pain.
Curious if you do place blame fully on the Democrats here. The Trump administration did have about 5 months from that first stimulus deal in March to reach some type of new agreement before the deadline earlier this month. They couldn't even agree with Senate Republicans at a point. By waiting until the 11th hour, House Democrats then had the leverage. Americans are upset. Who should they be angry with right now?
Everyone. I mean, when I was there, when I was there, we were in power, and we would have lots of conversations about deadlines that were coming up, whether it be the expiration of Pfizer, whether it be a continuing resolution. Nothing ever gets done in Washington until the last minute. I don't know how much you like psychology. I love it. It's like Munchausen's by proxy syndrome, where you create a catastrophe and then you want to be rewarded for fixing the catastrophe at the very end. It's just in this instance, they didn't fix it.
You are a contributor on Fox News. You're often brought on to talk about what conservatives call Obamagate, which is the Obama administration's investigation into the Trump campaign. You've criticized the intelligence community for using the unreliable Steele dossier to probe whether the campaign was compromised. How do you think that the intelligence community can regain the trust of conservatives?
Well, you have the intelligence community and then you have law enforcement. And the issue with the FBI is they try to play both roles. So the first thing the intelligence community can do for us is tell you what the word assessment means. Jill, you hear that word a lot. We have assessed. That is an educated opinion. So you may not recall this, but I was interviewing John Brennan one time when I was in Congress, and I used the word evidence. What evidence do you have to support it? And some of the folks in the media on the left were just furious with me for using the word evidence because that's not what the CIA does. They make assessments. Well, to most people, there's no difference. I mean, how can you assess something if there's no evidentiary basis? It's been a bad 4 years for the FBI. And it's one thing to use information that's not been vetted or verified. I mean, that's bad. You shouldn't do it. It's another thing to use information that you know is false. And it's increasingly looking like the Bureau, the FBI, knew that this information was not reliable, and they continued to use it. I was a prosecutor a lot longer time than I was a member of Congress. I have a high expectations for our justice system. I mean, after all, they work for a blindfolded woman. So when you don't meet my expectations, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I'm going to be upset. And the last 4 years have been terrible for the FBI and the Department of Justice.
Switching gears, some fraud charges were brought against former President Trump advisor Steve Bannon yesterday. I want to play quickly what the president had to say about it.
I feel very badly. I haven't been dealing with him for a long period of time, as most of the people in this room know. He was involved in our campaign. He worked for Goldman Sachs. He worked for a lot of companies, but he was involved likewise in our campaign and for a small part of the administration very early on. I haven't been dealing with him at all. I know nothing about the project other than I didn't like, when I read about it, I didn't like it.
The question is, though, should the president bear any responsibility for allowing shady figures like Bannon, Roger Stone, or Paul Manafort to influence our government processes?
I think the president would tell you if you were asking him that he was not served well by whoever did the vetting. I mean, we should have known that Paul Manafort was financially strapped because that is the very best motive someone has to hang over you to get you to do something. The Senate report said he was a counterintelligence threat. Well, he was a counterintelligence threat because he was in debt. Steve Bannon, you can read my deposition of him when I was in the House, and it won't take you long to figure out I don't like him. He takes credit for things that he does not deserve credit for. He wrote a kiss and tell book when he left the White House. He said Donald Trump Jr. engaged in treasonous activity, and he's the only person I've ever met that can elect a Democrat in Alabama. So I'm not a Steve Bannon fan. Having said that, he is presumed innocent, and that presumption remains with him unless he pleads guilty or is convicted by a jury.
During your time in Congress, you had to question Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton and James Comey. Here on Cheddar, we cover so many of these congressional hearings, like the big tech, for example, a couple weeks ago. How can lawmakers better use their time? Sometimes it just feels like lawmakers aren't even, up to speed on what the topic is. And that's both sides of the aisle.
Sometimes. Did you say sometimes? That would be most of the time. No, that'd be most of it. You're being charitable. The whole system is laughable. I mean, what other area of life would you concede the issues are really important and really complex, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes? You have 5 minutes to interview someone about encryption or 5 minutes to interview the attorney general. It's laughable. So either the voters need to demand a different structure, or Congress needs to say, you know what, why don't we give each side an hour? And then we'll let the people who really are good at asking questions use it. I mean, what did you see with Bill Barr? Reclaiming my time. Like they had separation anxiety from their time getting away from them. They all wanted to reclaim their time. I mean, you've got the top law enforcement figure in the country. Ask him a question and let him answer it. But they didn't do it, and there are times I'm sure I didn't do it either. 5 minutes is a joke within which to discuss complicated issues. And some of the members of Congress are more interested in their YouTube clicks than they are getting answers to legitimate questions.
I appreciate I appreciate your take on that one. As someone who often has to watch these hearings start to finish, and just quickly, your impressions of the first virtual convention. Democrats had their chance this week. Republicans are going next week. What did you make of it?
Well, it's tough. I mean, one of my best friends in the world is speaking Wednesday night at the Republican convention. It is tough to feel energy when you're in a room with just a camera. There's no audience. Having said that, the Democrats are going to have to decide, is their strategy to just fire up the base, or is their strategy to appeal to former Trump voters and try to convert them? If you like contrast, and that's what politics is about, you're going to see a lot of contrast, particularly as it relates to law enforcement and law and order and what's happening in the major cities. Virtual is tough. It is tough to connect to an audience when there is no audience. Biden, I thought, did a good job last night, but clearly he doesn't think he has to discuss policy. It's just going to be a personality contest. They tried that in 2016 and it didn't work out well.
All right. Trey Gowdy, former congressman from South Carolina and author of Doesn't Hurt to Ask, Using the Power of Questions to Communicate, Connect, and Persuade. Thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate your insight